We hope you enjoy this presentation of the 3324 Podcasts Holiday Treasury Volume 4, featuring Sean Grady, Christy Cuomo, Nick Leshi, and Dean Leggiero.
Christmas in 1776 by Anne Hollingsworth Wharton. On Christmas Day in 1776, our gallant troops with bayonets fixed to Trenton marched away. Children, have any of you ever thought of what little people like you were doing in this country more than 100 years ago when the cruel tide of war swept over its bosom? From many homes, the fathers were absent, fighting bravely for the liberty which we now enjoy, while the mothers, no less valiantly, struggle against hardships and discomforts in order to keep a home for their children, whom you only know as your great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers, dignified gentlemen and beautiful ladies whose painted portraits hang upon the walls in some of your homes. Merry, romping children they were in those far-off times, yet their bright faces must have looked grave sometimes, when they heard the grown people talk of the great things that were happening around them. Some of these little people never forgot the wonderful events of which they heard, and afterward related them to their children and grandchildren, which accounts for some of the interesting stories which you may still hear if you are good children. The Christmas story that I have to tell you is about a boy and a girl who lived in Bordentown, New Jersey. The father of these children was a soldier in General Washington's army, which was encamped a few miles north of Trenton on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. Bordentown, as you can see by looking on your map, if you have not hidden them all away for the holidays, is about 7 miles south of Trenton, where 1,500 Hessians and a troop of British light horse were holding the town. Thus you see that the British, in force, were between Washington's army and Bordentown, besides which there were some British and Hessian troops in the very town. All this seriously interfered with Captain Tracy's going home to eat his Christmas dinner with his wife and children. Kitty and Harry Tracy, who had not lived long enough to see many wars, could not imagine such a thing as Christmas without their father, and had busied themselves for weeks in making everything ready to have a merry time with him. Kitty, who loved to play quite as much as any frolicsome Kitty of today, had spent all her spare time in knitting a pair of thick woolen stockings, which seems a wonderful feat for a little girl only 8 years old to perform. Can you not see her sitting by the great chimney place, filled with its roaring, crackling logs, in her quaint, short-waisted dress, knitting away steadily and puckering up her rosy, dimpled face over the strange twists and turns of that old stocking? I can see her, and I could also hear her sweet voice as she chatters away to her mother about how surprised Papa will be to find that his little girl can knit like a grown-up woman, while Harry spreads out on the hearth a goodly store of shell barks that he has gathered and is keeping for his share of the surprise. "What if he shouldn't come?" asks Harry suddenly. "Oh, he'll come. Papa never stays away on Christmas," says Kitty, looking up into her mother's face for an echo to her words. Instead, she sees something very like tears in her mother's eyes. "Oh, Mama, don't you think he'll come?" "He will come if he possibly can," says Mrs. Tracy, "and if he cannot, we will keep Christmas whenever dear Papa does come home." "It won't be half so nice," said Kitty. "Nothing's so nice as really Christmas, and how's Kris Kringle going to know about it if we change the day?" "We'll let him come just the same, and if he brings anything for Papa, we can put it away for him." This plan, still, seemed a poor one to Miss Kitty, who went to her bed in a sober mood that night, and was heard telling her dear dolly, Martha Washington, that wars were miserable, and that when she married, she should have a man who kept a candy shop for a husband, and not a soldier. "No, Martha, not even if he's as nice as Papa." As Martha made no objection to this little arrangement, being an obedient child, they were both soon fast asleep. The days of that cold winter of 1776 wore on. So cold it was that the sufferings of the soldiers were great, their bleeding feet often leaving marks on the pure white snow over which they marched. As Christmas drew near, there was a feeling among the patriots that some blow was about to be struck. But what it was, and from whence, they knew not. And, better than all, the British had no idea that any strong blow could come from Washington's army, weak and out of heart, as they thought, after being chased through Jersey by Cornwallis. Mrs. Tracy looked anxiously each day for news of the husband and father only a few miles away, yet so separated by the river and the enemy's troops that they seemed like 100. Christmas Eve came, but brought with it few rejoicings. The hearts of the people were too sad to be taken up with merrymaking, although the Hessian soldiers in the town, good-natured Germans who only fought the Americans because they were paid for it, gave themselves up to the feasting and revelry. "Shall we hang up our stockings?" asked Kitty in a rather doleful voice. "Yes," said her mother. "Santa Claus won't forget you, I'm sure, although he has been kept pretty busy looking after the soldiers this winter." "Which side is he on?" asked Harry. "The right side, of course," said Mrs. Tracy, which was the most sensible answer she could possibly have given. So the stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. Two little rosy faces lay fast asleep upon the pillow when the good old soul came dashing over the roof about 1 o'clock, and after filling each stocking with red apples and leaving a cornucopia of sugar plums for each child, he turned for a moment to look at the sleeping faces, for St. Nicholas has a tender spot in his great big heart for a soldier's children. Then, remembering many other small folks waiting for him all over the land, he sprang up the chimney and was away in a trice. Santa Claus, in the form of Mrs. Tracy's farmer brother, brought her a splendid turkey, but because the Hessians were uncommonly fond of turkey, it came hidden under a load of wood. Harry was very fond of turkey, too, as well as of all other good things, but when his mother said, "It's such a fine bird, it seems too bad to eat it without father," Harry cried out, "Yes, keep it for Papa," and Kitty joining in the chorus, the vote was unanimous, and the turkey was hung away to await the return of the good soldier, although it seemed strange, as Kitty told Martha Washington, to have no papa and no turkey on Christmas Day. The day passed, and night came, cold with a steady fall of rain and sleet. Kitty prayed that her dear papa might not be out in the storm, and that he might come home and wear his beautiful blue stockings. "And eat his turkey," said Harry's sleepy voice, after which they were soon in the land of dreams. Toward morning, the good people in Bordentown were suddenly aroused by firing in the distance, which became more and more distinct as the day wore on. There was great excitement in the town. Men and women gathered together in little groups in the streets to wonder what it was all about, and neighbors came dropping into Mrs. Tracy's parlor all day long, one after the other, to say what they thought of the firing. In the evening, there came a body of Hessians flying into the town to say that General Washington had surprised the British at Trenton early that morning and completely routed them, which so frightened the Hessians in Bordentown that they left without the slightest ceremony. It was a joyful hour to the good town people when the Red Jackets turned their backs on them, thinking every moment that the Patriot army would be after them. Indeed, it seemed as if the wonders would never cease that day, for while the rejoicings were still loud over the departure of the enemy, there came a knock at Mrs. Tracy's door, and while she was wondering whether she dared open it, it was pushed ajar, and a tall soldier entered. What a scream of delight greeted that soldier, and how Kitty and Harry danced about him and clung to his knees, while Mrs. Tracy drew him toward the warm blaze and held him off with his damp cloak. Cold and tired Captain Tracy was, after a night's march in the streets and a day's fighting, but He was not too weary to smile at the dear faces around him, or to pat Kitty's head when she brought his warm stockings and would put them on the tired feet herself. Suddenly, there was a sharp, quick bark outside the door. "What's that?" cried Harry. "Oh, I forgot. Open the door. Here, Fido. Fido!" Into the room there sprang a beautiful little King Charles spaniel, white, with tan spots and ears of the longest, softest, and silkiest. "What a little dear!" exclaimed Kitty. "Where did it come from?" "From the Battle of Trenton," said her father. "His poor master was shot. After the redcoats had turned their backs, and I was hurrying along one of the streets where the fight had been the fiercest, I heard a low groan, and turning, saw a British officer lying among a number of slain. I raised his head. He begged for some water, which I brought him, and bending down my ear I heard him whisper, 'Dying. Last battle. Say a little prayer.' He tried to follow me in the words of a prayer, and then, taking my hand, laid it on something soft and warm, nestling close up to his breast. It was this little dog. The gentleman, for he was a real gentleman, gasped out, 'Take care of my poor Fido. Good night,' and was gone. It was as much as I could do to get the little creature away from his dead master. He clung to him as if he loved him better than life. You'll take care of him, won't you, children? I brought him home to you for a Christmas present." "Pretty little Fido," said Kitty, taking the soft, curly creature into her arms. "I think it's the best present in the world, and tomorrow's to be real Christmas because you are home, Papa." "And we'll eat the turkey," said Harry, "and shellbarks, lots of them, that I saved for you. What a good time we'll have. And oh, Papa, don't go to war any more, but stay at home with Mother and Kitty and Fido and me." "What would become of our country if we should all do that, my little man? It was a good day's work that we did this Christmas, getting the army all across the river so quickly and quietly that we surprised the enemy and gained a victory with the loss of few men. Thus it was that some of the good people of 1776 spent their Christmas, that their children and grandchildren might spend many of them as citizens of a free nation."
Christmas in the Barn by Emily Polson. Only 2 more days and Christmas would be here. It had been snowing hard, and Johnny was standing at the window, looking at the soft, white snow which covered the ground half a foot deep. Presently, he heard the noise of wheels coming up the road, and a wagon turned in at the gate and came past the window. Johnny was very curious to know what the wagon could be bringing. He pressed his little nose close to the cold window pane, and to his great surprise, saw 2 large Christmas trees. Johnny wondered why there were 2 trees, and turned quickly to run and tell Mama all about it, but then remembered that Mama was not at home. She had gone to the city to buy some Christmas presents and would not return until quite late. Johnny began to feel that his toes and fingers had grown quite cold from standing at the window so long, so he drew his own little chair up to the cheerful grate fire and sat there quietly thinking. Kitty, who had been curled up like a little bundle of wool in the very warmest corner, jumped up and, going to Johnny, rubbed her head against his knee to attract his attention. He patted her gently and began to talk to her about what was in his thoughts. He had been puzzling over the 2 trees which had come, and at last had made up his mind about them. "I know now, Kitty," said he, "why there are 2 trees. This morning when I kissed Papa goodbye at the gate, he said he was going to buy one for me, and Mama, who was busy in the house, did not hear him say so, and I am sure she must have bought the other. But what shall we do with 2 Christmas trees?" Kitty jumped into his lap and purred and purred. A plan suddenly flashed into Johnny's mind. Would you like to have one, Kitty?" Kitty purred more loudly, and it seemed almost as though she had said yes. "Oh, I will, if Mama will let me. I'll have a Christmas tree out in the barn for you, Kitty, and for all the pets. And then you'll be as happy as I shall be with my tree in the parlor." By this time it had grown quite late. There was a ring at the doorbell, and quick as a flash Johnny ran, with happy, smiling face, to meet Papa and Mama, and gave them each a loving kiss. During the evening he told them all that he had done that day, and also about the 2 big trees which the man had brought. It was just as Johnny had thought. Papa and Mama had each bought one, and as it was so near Christmas, they thought they would not send either of them back. Johnny was very glad of this, and told them of the happy plan he had made, and asked if he might have the extra tree. Papa and Mama smiled a little as Johnny explained his plan, but they said he might have the tree, and Johnny went to bed feeling very happy. That night, his papa fastened the tree into a block of wood so that it would stand firmly, and then set it in the middle of the barn floor. The next day when Johnny had finished his lessons, he went to the kitchen and asked Annie, the cook, if she would save the bones and potato parings and all other leavings from the day's meals and give them to him the following morning. He also begged her to give him several cupfuls of salt and cornmeal, which she did, putting them in paper bags for him. Then she gave him the dishes he asked for, a few chipped ones not good enough to be used at table, and an old wooden bowl. Annie wanted to know what Johnny intended to do with all these things, but he only said, "Wait until tomorrow, then you shall see." He gathered up all the things which the cook had given him and carried them to the barn, placing them on a shelf in one corner, where he was sure no one would touch them, and where they would be all ready for him to use the next morning. Christmas morning came, and as soon as he could, Johnny hurried out to the barn, where stood the Christmas tree which he was going to trim for all his pets. The first thing he did was to get a paper bag of oats. This he tied to one of the branches of the tree, for Brownie the mare. Then he made up several bundles of hay and tied these on the other side of the tree, not quite so high up, where Whiteface, the cow, could reach them. And then on the lowest branches some more hay for Spotty, the calf. Next, Johnny hurried to the kitchen to get the things Annie had promised to save for him. She had plenty to give. With his arms and hands full, he went back to the barn. He found 3 lovely bones with plenty of meat on them. These he tied together to another branch of the tree, for Rover, his big black dog. Under the tree he placed the big wooden bowl and filled it well with potato parings, rice, and meat left from yesterday's dinner. This was the full and tempting trough for Piggywig. Near this he placed a bowl of milk for Kitty, on one plate the salt for the pet lamb, and on another the cornmeal for the dear little chickens. On the top of the tree he tied a basket of nuts. These were for his pet squirrel. And I had almost forgotten to tell you of the bunch of carrots tied very low down where soft white Bunny could reach them. When all was done, Johnny stood off a little way to look at this wonderful Christmas tree. Clapping his hands with delight, he ran to call Papa and Mama and Annie, and they laughed aloud when they saw what he had done. It was the funniest Christmas tree they had ever seen. They were sure the pets would like the presents Johnny had chosen. Then there was a busy time in the barn. Papa and Mama and Annie helped about bringing in the animals, and before long, Brownie, Whiteface, Spotty, Rover, Piggywig, Kitty, Lambkin, the chickens, the squirrel, and Bunny, the rabbit, had been led each to his own Christmas breakfast on and under the tree. What a funny sight it was to see them all standing around looking happy and contented, eating and drinking with such an appetite. While watching them, Johnny had another thought, and he ran quickly to the house and brought out the new trumpet which Papa had given him for Christmas. By this time, the animals had all finished their breakfast, and Johnny gave a little toot on his trumpet as a signal that the tree festival was over. Brownie went neighing and prancing to her stall. Whiteface walked demurely off with a bellow, which Spotty, the calf, running at her heels, tried to imitate. The little lamb skipped bleating away. Piggywig walked off with a grunt. Kitty jumped on the fence with a mew. The squirrel sat up in the tree, cracking her nuts. Bunny hopped to her snug little quarters, while Rover, barking loudly, chased the chickens back to their coop. Such a hubbub of noises. Mama said it sounded as if they were trying to say, "Merry Christmas to you, Johnny. Merry Christmas to all."
Why the Chimes Rang by Raymond McCaldon. There was once in a faraway country, where few people have ever traveled, a wonderful church. It stood on a high hill in the midst of a great city, and every Sunday, as well as on sacred days like Christmas, thousands of people climbed the hill to its great archways, looking like lines of ants, all moving in the same direction. When you came to the building itself, you found stone columns and dark passages, and a grand entrance leading to the main room of the church. This room was so long that one standing at the doorway could scarcely see to the other end, where the choir stood by the marble altar. In the farthest corner was the organ, and this organ was so loud that sometimes when it played, the people for miles around would close their shutters and prepare for a great thunderstorm. Altogether, no such church as this was ever seen before, especially when it was lighted up for some festival and crowded with people, young and old. But the strangest thing about the whole building was the wonderful chime of bells. At one corner of the church was a great gray tower, with ivy growing over it as far up as one could see. I say as far as one could see, because the tower was quite great enough to fit the great church, and it rose so far into the sky that it was only in very fair weather that anyone claimed to be able to see the top. Even then, one could not be certain that it was in sight. Up and up and up climbed the stones and the ivy, and as the man who built the church had been dead for hundreds of years, everyone had forgotten how high the tower was supposed to be. Now all the people knew that at the top of the tower was a chime of Christmas bells. They had hung there ever since the church had been built, and were the most beautiful bells in the world. Some thought it was because a great musician had cast them and arranged them in their place. Others said it was because of the great height, which reached up where the air was clearest and purest. However that might be, no one who had ever heard the chimes denied that they were the sweetest in the world. Some described them as sounding like angels far up in the sky, others as sounding like strange winds singing through the trees. But the fact was that no one had heard them for years and years. There was an old man living not far from the church who said that his mother had spoken of hearing them when she was a little girl, and he was the only one who was sure of as much as that. They were Christmas chimes, you see, and were not meant to be played by men, or on common days. It was the custom on Christmas Eve for all the people to bring to the church their offerings to the Christ child. And when the greatest and best offering was laid on the altar, there used to come sounding through the music of the choir the Christmas chimes far up in the tower. Some said that the wind rang them, and others that they were so high that the angels could set them swinging. But for many long years they had never been heard. It was said that people had been growing less careful of their gifts for the Christ child, and that no offering was brought great enough to deserve the music of the chimes. Every Christmas Eve, the rich people still crowded to the altar, each one trying to bring some better gift than any other, without giving anything that he wanted for himself. And the church was crowded with those who thought that perhaps the wonderful bells might be heard again. But although the service was splendid and the offerings plenty, only the roar of the wind could be heard far up in the stone tower. Now, a number of miles from the city, in a little country village, where nothing could be seen of the great church but glimpses of the tower when the weather was fine, lived a boy named Pedro and his little brother. They knew very little about the Christmas chimes, but they had heard of the service in the church on Christmas Eve, and had a secret plan which they had often talked over when by themselves, to go to see the beautiful celebration. "Nobody can guess, little brother," Pedro would say, "all the fine things there are to see and hear. And I have even heard it said that the Christ child sometimes comes down to bless the service. What if we could see him?" The day before Christmas was bitterly cold, with a few lonely snowflakes flying in the air, and a hard white crust on the ground. Sure enough, Pedro and little brother were able to slip quietly away early in the afternoon, and although the walking was hard in the frosty air, before nightfall they had trudged so far, hand in hand, that they saw the lights of the big city just ahead of them. Indeed, they were about to enter one of the great gates in the wall that surrounded it, when they saw something dark on the snow near their path, and stepped aside to look at it. It was a poor woman who had fallen just outside the city, too sick and tired to get in where she might have found shelter. The soft snow made of a drift a sort of pillow for her, and she would soon be so sound asleep in the wintry air that no one could ever waken her again. All this Pedro saw in a moment, and he knelt down beside her and tried to rouse her, even tugging at her arm a little, as though he would have tried to carry her away. He turned her face toward him, so that he could rub some of the snow on it, and when he had looked at her silently a moment, he stood up again and said, "It's no use, little brother. You will have to go on alone." "Alone?" cried little brother. "And you not see the Christmas festival?" "No," said Pedro, and he could not keep back a bit of a choking sound in his throat. "See this poor woman. Her face looks like the Madonna in the chapel window, and she will freeze to death if nobody cares for her. Everyone has gone to the church now, but when you come back, you can bring someone to help her. I will rub her to keep her from freezing, and perhaps get her to eat the bun that is left in my pocket." "But I cannot bear to leave you and go on alone," said little brother. "Both of us need not miss the service," said Pedro. "It had better be I than you. You can easily find your way to church, and you must see and hear everything twice, little brother, once for you and once for me. I am sure the Christ child must know how I should love to come with you and worship him. And oh, if you get a chance, little brother, to slip up to the altar without getting in anyone's way, take this little silver piece of mine and lay it down for my offering when no one is looking. Do not forget where you have left me, and forgive me for not going with you." In this way he hurried little brother off to the city and winked hard to keep back the tears, as he heard the crunching footsteps sounding farther and farther away in the twilight. It was pretty hard to lose the music and splendor of the Christmas celebration that he had been planning for so long, and spend the time instead in that lonely place in the snow. The great church was a wonderful place that night. Everyone said that it had never looked so bright and beautiful before. When the organ played and the thousands of people sang, the walls shook with the sound, and little Pedro, away outside the city wall, felt the earth tremble around him. At the close of the service came the procession with the offerings to be laid on the altar. Rich men and great men marched proudly up to lay down their gifts to the Christ child. Some brought wonderful jewels, some baskets of gold so heavy that they could scarcely carry them down the aisle. A great writer laid down a book that he had been making for years and years. And last of all walked the king of the country, hoping with all the rest to win for himself the chime of the Christmas bells. There went a great murmur through the church as the people saw the king take from his head the royal crown, all set with precious stones, and lay it gleaming on the altar as his offering to the Holy Child. "Surely," everyone said, "we shall hear the bells now, for nothing like this has ever happened before." But still, only the cold old wind was heard in the tower, and the people shook their heads, and some of them said, as they had before, that they never really believed the story of the chimes, and doubted if they ever rang at all. The procession was over, and the choir began the closing hymn. Suddenly, the organist stopped playing, and everyone looked at the old minister, who was standing by the altar, holding up his hand for silence. Not a sound could be heard from anyone in the church, but as all the people strained their ears to listen, there came softly, but distinctly, swinging through the air, the sound of the chimes in the tower. So far away and yet so clear the music seemed, so much sweeter were the notes than anything that had been heard before, rising and falling away up there in the sky, that the people in the church sat for a moment as still as though something held each of them by the shoulders. Then they all stood up together and stared straight at the altar to see what great gift had awakened the long, silent bells. But all that the nearest of them saw was the childish figure of little brother, who had crept softly down the aisle when no one was looking, and had laid Pedro's little piece of silver on the altar.
A letter from Santa Claus, written by Mark Twain to his daughter, Susie. Palace of St. Nicholas in the Moon, Christmas morning. My dear Susie Clemens, I have received and read all the letters which you and your little sister have written me. I can read your and your baby sister's jagged and fantastic marks without any trouble at all. But I had trouble with those letters which you dictated through your mother and the nurses, for I am a foreigner and cannot read English writing well. You will find that I made no mistakes about the things which you and the baby ordered in your own letters. I went down your chimney at midnight when you were asleep and delivered them all myself, and kissed the both of you too. But there were one or two small orders which I could not fill because we ran out of stock. There was a word or two in your mamma's letter which I took to be a trunk full of doll's clothes. Is that it? I will call at your kitchen door about 9 o'clock this morning to inquire. But I must not see anybody, and I must not speak to anybody but you. When the kitchen doorbell rings, George must be blindfolded and sent to the door. You must tell George he must walk on tiptoe and not speak. Otherwise he will die some day. Then you must go up to the nursery and stand on a chair or the nurse's bed and put your ear to the speaking tube that leads down to the kitchen, and when I whistle through it, you must speak in the tube and say, "Welcome, Santa Claus." Then I will ask whether it was a trunk you ordered or not. If you say it was, I shall ask you what color you want the trunk to be, and then you must tell me every single thing in detail which you want the trunk to contain. Then when I say, "Goodbye and a Merry Christmas to my little Susie Clemens," you must say, "Goodbye, good old Santa Claus. I thank you very much." Then you must go down into the library and make George close all the doors that open into the main hall, and everybody must keep still for a little while. I will go to the moon and get those things, and in a few minutes I will come down the chimney that belongs to the fireplace that is in the hall. If it is a trunk you want, because I couldn't get such a thing as a trunk down the nursery chimney, you know, if I should leave any snow in the hall, you must tell George to sweep it into the fireplace, for I haven't time to do such things. George must not use a broom but a rag, else he will die some day. If my boot should leave a stain on the marble, George must not wholly stone it away. Leave it there always, in memory of my visit, and whenever you look at it or show it to anybody, you must let it remind you to be a good little girl. Whenever you are naughty, and someone points to that mark which your good old Santa Claus's boot made on the marble, what will you say, little sweetheart? Goodbye for a few minutes, till I come down to the world and ring the kitchen doorbell. Your loving Santa Claus, whom people sometimes call the Man in the Moon.